Hi, this is Scott. So we're going to just do some real quick finance fundamentals. I'm guessing most people haven't taken a finance course, and that's totally fine. So what we're going to do is just try and get some of these basic foundations and intuitions in place, so that way for the rest of the unit, you have something to sort of lay the foundation on. So the first foundational topic is opportunity cost, which we've talked about before. So the opportunity cost is the next best option to whatever you selected. If tonight I can go to a Twins game or go to Valley Fair, go to a movie, do laundry, go grocery shopping, or watch that hideously awful Barney the Dinosaur show. If I decide to go to the Twins game, while I'm giving up all of those things, my opportunity cost is really the next best option. It's if the Twins game got canceled, what would I do? Maybe I'd go to Valley Fair. I was never really going to watch Barney the Dinosaur anyway, because as soon as I could have gone grocery shopping, this one was out of the picture. So opportunity cost is the next best option. It's what you could have done had what you selected not been available. Now, lots of finance deals with what's called intertemporal substitution, which is just a really fancy way of saying people borrow against themselves for different time periods. So if I think about my life, or most people's life, we can think about when you're young and you're making low income, and then you sort of enter your career working ages and you're making higher income, and then pre-retirement and retirement. When you are younger, you're maybe borrowing and trying to even out your life. So if you're taking student loans, you're borrowing against future income. I'm now middle-aged, so I'm saving for retirement. Then when I get towards retirement, I'm going to use some of that surplus to supplement my income to get my consumption back up to a more even level. I don't want to go from starving to eating steak to starving again. I want sort of a steady, smooth consumption. So it's time to talk about loans. How do I take out loans? How do you take out loans? There are three main components. It's the principal, which is how much money you're wanting to borrow. It's the term. In other words, how long do you want a loan? So car loans could be 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. I think there are even 6-year loans. Home loans are 15 years or 20 years or 30 years. So there are different lengths that you're going to have the loan. And then the interest rate, which is the cost of borrowing. So typically loans are done at a annualized rate, how much per year. But as you're going to see later on in one of the discussion questions, that sometimes they'll just say, on a short payday loan, it's going to cost you $20 this month to borrow $100. Well, if you take $20 a month times 12, it's a huge annualized interest rate. We want to think about annualized in terms of how much would it have been over the course of a year. It's a way to standardize. The first type of loan is called a simple interest loan. And a simple interest loan is just what it sounds. If you're going to borrow $500 from the bank for 6 months, which is a half a year, how much interest are you going to have to pay? Well, you're taking out $500 at 6% interest. In other words, if you held it for an entire year, you'd have to pay $30, but you're not going to hold it for the entire year. You're only holding it for half of a year, so you're going to pay $15 interest. It's a one-time calculation, and there's no compounding. So we'll talk about compounding next. Compound interest is where you can earn interest on top of interest. Let's pretend I deposit $10,000 in the bank and I can get 10% interest. My first year, I put $10,000 in and I get 10% interest, so they're going to pay me $1,000 in interest. So the end of the first year, I have $11,000 in the bank. The end of the first year is the same as the start of my second year, but now I get 10% interest on the $11,000, not on the $10,000. So I'm earning interest on top of interest, and I earn $1,100. So at the end of my second year, I'm at $12,100. Now that becomes the start of my next year, right? And I earn interest on top of interest. So I'm not earning $1,000 every period. I'm earning more and more and more because I'm earning interest on top of interest. That's the magic of compounding. So this idea of compounding brings us to future value. If you put $1,000 in the bank now and the going interest rate's 10%, after 3 years, it's worth $1,331. If I came to you and said, how much is $1,000 worth? $1,000 today, how much is it worth in 3 years? You'd say $1,331 because you could put the same amount of money in the bank and have that return. The same thing is true with present value. If I said, how much would you be willing to pay for $1,331? If I give it to you 3 years from now, you'd think to yourself and say, well, if the going interest rate is 10%, how much money would I have to put in the bank now in order to get $1,331, which would be exactly $1,000, right? If I was willing to sell it to you for under $1,000, you would make money. If it was more than $1,000, it would be better for you to just deposit the $1,000 yourself. So we could figure out present value T years out and just discount it back. While future value looked at the number of times exponentially, what we're going to do is we're going to discount it backwards just like before. So to get to the $1,000, you say, well, what's the future value? How much are you willing to give me in the future? And discount it by the interest rate for T number of years. So 1331 divided by 1.1 to the third is $1,000. This idea that the same money has different value depending on when you're looking at it is called the time value of money. And what you need to know is, are you talking about now or in the future? And are you going to discount the future, or are you going to take today's money and compound it out into the future? So that's all we're looking at. Why are we discounting the future? Well, people are also impatient. You'd rather have an ice cream cone now than in 2 years, right? People have to be compensated now to delay consumption and to delay using their resources for later. So let's get back to loans and the finance intuition. When we talk about term, the longer you're going to delay me from my consumption, the more you're going to have to compensate me. Another way to think about that is, if I lend you $1,000 and the going interest rate is 10%, at the end, I'm going to get $1,100. If you need it for 2 years, there's that compounding thing again, right? So now if I put $1,000 in the bank, at the end of 2 years, I would have $1,210. It's not just $100 a year, there's the compounding. The more that I delay my consumption, the more I lend to you and the longer the term, you're going to have to compensate me more and more and more. So the longer the term on the loan, the more it's going to cost you. Now this one's pretty obvious. The more interest rates that you're being charged, the more the loan is going to cost you. You'd rather borrow from me at 5% than 10%. So this concept of a dollar having different purchasing power over time is tied to a concept of macroeconomics called inflation. Inflation is something you're probably aware of. Dollar used to be able to buy a lot more a while ago than it can now. I'll also point out that with inflation, typically incomes also change almost proportionally to inflation. Not always, but across the economy, it certainly must be that the inflation rate is the same as the income rate, because your spending is someone else's income. But let's talk about what inflation means, because it's going to be real important for us to talk about real versus nominal. So here's an oversimplified example of why real versus nominal is going to be real important. Let's say, just to make numbers real easy, I make $100,000 a year and every bottle of Coke I buy is $1. Then really my salary is equivalent to the purchasing power of 100,000 bottles of Coke. Now I walk into my boss's office and he thinks I'm doing a great job and gives me a 20% raise. Am I better off? Before you answer that so quickly, we need to think about what's happening with prices. Prices went up by more than 20%. I'm going to be able to buy less than 100,000 bottles of Coke. I would actually be worse off. But if I'm given a 20% raise and prices only went up by 10%, then I have $120,000 and the soda only costs $1.10. So then I'd be able to buy more than 100,000 bottles of soda. Well, then I'm better off. So we want to think about not just the nominal increase, which is a 20% pay raise. We want to think about the real increase. And the real is always in terms of your purchasing power. My real salary would have gone up if my raise was 20% and prices went up by less than 20%. So real variables, whether we're talking about real salary, real prices, real anything, has the impact of inflation removed from it. Nominal just says you got a 20% raise, and it doesn't tell you anything about how price levels are changing. So let's talk about risk. Risk is a foundational concept when we're talking about personal finance and consumer economics. So let's pretend that you own a bank and you don't have to pay your employees anything. Matter of fact, you're a nonprofit bank. You're not even trying to make money. So your goal is to break even. What we want to show is there a relationship between the risk of the pool of people and the interest rate you have to charge them? And of course, the answer is going to be yes, but let's really call this out in this extreme example. So in group one, you have 10 people who want to borrow $1,000 from you, and you anticipate that one of them is going to default on the loan and pay you back nothing. In the group two, which is lower risk, you have a pool of 100 people, and you're expecting 1 out of 100 to default. So here you have a 10% default rate. Here you have a 1% default rate. What interest rate are you going to charge them? Take a second and try and calculate the interest you're going to charge them before you move on. Do you have it? Okay, let's go to the next slide. So for group one, the higher risk, you're going to have to charge them a higher interest rate. You're lending out $10,000. You're only going to be paid back by 9 people, so each person has to pay you back $1,111. If that's the case, you're you're going to charge them 11% interest rate. Now that you've seen this, what is the interest rate you're going to need to charge group 2, which will be the lower risk? If you haven't already done so, let's try and have you figure out the interest rate you would charge that lower risk group. So group 2 is the lower risk. You're going to lend out $100,000 and 99 people will pay you back. So you need $100,000 divided by 99, and each person has to pay you back $1,010. Well, that's just barely a 1% interest rate. You compare those two, that's dramatically different. So with this example, what I'm trying to show is that the risk is what generates the interest rate. It wasn't a profit motive. You didn't try to make any profit. It wasn't a cost motive. It wasn't that the higher risk people had more paperwork to do. It was a risk was completely driven to interest rates. The higher the risk, the higher people have to pay. Use this in your own life. When you want to take out a car loan or a house loan, they're going to do a credit check on you. Why? Because they're trying to figure out, do we put you in the low pool, the medium pool, the high risk pool? Because they're going to charge you a different interest rate based on your risk. Now notice, our pool size was really small, but even in the high risk pool of 10 people, 9 of them, 90%, didn't default, and they had to pay a higher interest rate. Why? Because they were not able to signal to the lender saying, you know what, I should be in the low risk pool. That is going to be one of the things we're going to be looking at, is how do you signal to the lenders that you should be in the lower risk so that way you won't have to pay the higher interest rate.